Most people who drive past or even work in this unremarkable office building probably don't give it much thought. What they might not realize is that it's the location of one of Ogden's oldest and strangest unsolved murders. Join me as we go back 85 years and examine the death of Joseph Fay Summerall. On the morning of December 17, 1935, around 7 a.m., Joseph DeBry arrived for his shift at the Utah Ice and Storage Company plant in downtown Ogden, Utah. He took a quick walk around the outside of the building, and finding all the doors locked and nothing seemed unusual, he went inside. He headed towards the locker room to change into his work clothes. The plant was unusually cold, and he heard no sound of the night watchman, Joseph Summerall. When he got into the locker room, he saw Summerall's clothes and other personal items hanging neatly in his locker. He knew he must still be in the building, but thought it strange that he hadn't seen or heard him. DeBry glanced through the main rooms of the plant, and still not finding Summerall, he headed towards the boiler room in the basement. The boiler room was empty, and he found that the fire in the furnace was out, and the water level was unusually low. Normally, before DeBry would leave for the night, he would turn the stoker down to save on heating costs, and Summerall would turn it up in the morning just enough to keep the chill off so the building was warm when the other employees arrived around 8 a.m. On this morning, however, he found the stoker was cranked all the way up, and the coal hopper was completely empty. He peeked into the main furnace door, and not seeing anything strange, he started a small fire with paper and matches until he could figure out what was going on and where Summerall was. He went to the back of the large furnace and opened up the combustion door to take out the clinkers. It was at this point when he saw lying inside the furnace the body of who he assumed was Joseph. He immediately called his brother Frank, who was the plant superintendent, and Frank in turn called the Ogden police. Within a matter of minutes, police arrived, and the investigation of what would turn out to be one of Ogden's most unusual crimes would begin. For whatever reason, once police arrived, Joe volunteered to climb inside the furnace to retrieve the body. Maybe it was because he was a slim man who could fit into the tight space and was familiar with the workings of a giant furnace. I should point out that this was a 12 by 15 foot furnace with two main doors at the front and a small 18-inch side door near the rear of the furnace. The walls were 1 foot thick. Before we get into the rest of the investigation, I want to share some details that will be important to know later on. The first is that DeBry would tell police when he opened the combustion door to remove the clinkers, it was latched. There was no latch on the inside of the furnace. When police arrived, they noted that the body was laying completely straight in the furnace with the head on the ledge of the combustion door. DeBry pulled the body out, and it quickly became clear that it had been in the furnace for a significant period of time. The clothing was burned off from the waist down, the legs were reduced to ash just above the knees, and both arms were burned off just below the elbows. The rest of the body was completely burned, as the newspapers would put it, to a crisp. It should be pointed out that the police had to help DeBry climb into the furnace. The body would be identified as Joseph Summerall based initially on the leather hat band that was still attached to the skull, and later confirmed by his dental work. DeBry told police he knew it was Summerall because the leather band belonged to a cap that he himself had given to Summerall a few months prior. Joseph Summerall was a 32-year-old man who had worked at the plant for 9 years. He died just 2 days shy of his 33rd birthday. He had spent most of his life in Ogden, had been married for 11 years, and was the father of 6 children, one of whom was not even a month old at the time of his death. After the body was removed and sent for autopsy, the police asked DeBry to crawl back into the furnace and search for any remnants of a bullet or anything else that might be of interest. After searching the furnace, DeBry said there was no melted metal anywhere, and he couldn't see any marks on the bricks to indicate any of them had been struck by a bullet. Importantly, Summerall's keys, which DeBry said he always kept in his pants pocket, were never found. The police asked DeBry to search the plant to see if anything was missing or out of place, while they began looking around the boiler room, the area they believed was the scene of the crime. They soon noticed Summerall's watchman's clock lying on a shelf on a coal bin near the boiler. Nothing was out of place. There was no sign of a struggle in the boiler room or anywhere else inside or outside of the plant for that matter. Part of Summerall's duties were to make hourly rounds and punch a time clock at various spots inside and outside of the plant. He had last punched his clock at 1 a.m. at an ice door about 20 feet across a loading area from the boiler room. The police checked all the exterior doors to the plant, and every one of them was closed and latched, except for one. Although both of the sliding doors at the back of the plant were closed, only one was still latched on the inside. DeBry would return to let the police know that nothing appeared to have been taken or was out of place. The drawers and the safe in the plant office were closed and hadn't been tampered with. Ogden police were baffled, and if you think the autopsy and coroner's inquest would shed some light on Summerall's death, think again. The autopsy showed there was a 6-inch skull fracture from one temple to the other. Dr. W.J. Wilson said the fracture could have been caused by a blow to the head or heat from the furnace. They leaned towards Summerall having been shot in the head due to jagged holes being found at each end of the skull fracture. I recently spoke with a forensic pathologist who said the jagged holes alone weren't a good indicator of the fracture being caused by a bullet. Unfortunately, with little information and no contemporary records available, the actual cause of the skull fracture will never be known. There was also a possible bullet wound in the chest, although it was impossible to determine due to the state of the remains. And on top of all that, no bullets were ever found. The inquest was also not of much help. County Coroner Hiram Belknap testified that he didn't believe Summerall could have closed the furnace door himself. Additionally, physicians testified that if he had somehow been able to crawl into the furnace alive, his body would have been twisted and contorted due to the immense heat and excruciating pain. The time of death was estimated to have been sometime after Summerall's last punch at 1 a.m. and before his next punch was due at 2 a.m. The end result of the coroner's jury was that Summerall had been struck on the head and body with a blunt instrument and the body shoved into the blazing firebox. Police said that the furnace would have been burning at about 350 degrees, which they believe ruled out suicide. They didn't believe that a man could have climbed into a blazing furnace and remained flat on his back while being burned to death. However, they could find no motive and no clues that would point to murder. They also believed that whoever killed Summerall would have had to have had decent knowledge of the layout of the plant. Following the verdict of the coroner's jury, the Ogden furnace murder case seemed to quickly disappear from the news. Only one man was ever held for questioning, and he was released after proving what the police described as an airtight alibi. This man was Charles Rhodes, another night engineer at the plant with which Summerall alternated shifts. I should point out that Charles was of similar build and appearance to Joseph. From the start, the police wavered between suicide and murder. Summerall's family, on the other hand, never wavered in their belief that Summerall was murdered. Chief of Police Ryle Moore did have a good point to a Standard Examiner reporter. Quote, "It is difficult to believe that a murderer would hit a man across the forehead, fracturing his skull without knocking his cap off. And it is even more difficult to believe the murderer replaced the cap carefully, billed to the front, and then placed the body in the combustion chamber when the firebox with its bed of roaring coals was more convenient and certainly more useful in disposing of the body." In the weeks prior to his death, he complained to his wife and parents that he was having trouble with coal thieves on an almost nightly basis. His wife told police that he confided in her that he was worried harm could come to him from trying to stop the thieves. Summerall's widow left Ogden following his death and moved back to Brigham City to live with her parents. Joseph Summerall is buried in the Brigham City Cemetery, later to be surrounded by some of his children. As I was researching this story, I came upon an interesting mention in the Ogden Standard Examiner dated February 16, 1938. A 40-year-old man named Harvey Davis pleaded guilty to a charge of petty larceny and was sentenced to 90 days in jail. His crime is the intriguing part. He stole a furnace grate from the Utah Ice and Storage Company. Joseph DeBry happened to be the person who requested Davis be arrested. Interestingly enough, as I looked more into Harvey Davis's life, he was sentenced to 15 days in jail for stealing coal on December 8th, 1937. Obviously, it would be a stretch without knowing a lot more information to accuse Harvey Davis of the murder of Joseph Summerall, but his history and his choice of items to steal are definitely compelling. Harvey was known as a thief, and his main job was that of a junk dealer. It seems as if he would steal whatever he could get his hands on: a gun, canned goods from a warehouse, sacks from a different warehouse. But why a furnace grate specifically? I can't imagine there would have been much worth in something like that. Now that you know the basics of Summerall's death, let's explore some of the questions left unanswered. Would it have been possible for a 6-foot-tall, 200-pound man to crawl through a door only 18 inches square into a combustion chamber that was blazing with heat? Could he have slammed shut the door, which was found latched from the outside? If so, why wasn't the body found contorted from pain instead of lying flat on its back? Could the front part of the skull have been cracked by heat when thinner parts of the skull had no fractures? Why were there no signs of struggle or robbery at the plant? Why was the body placed in the combustion chamber instead of the firebox where it would have been cremated much faster? Was Summerall a victim of mistaken identity? He had just gone back to the night shift after being furloughed for 2 weeks, taking over for Frank Rhodes. And lastly, whatever happened to his keys? And that's the end of the Ogden furnace murder. Thank you so much for watching, and if you like this video, you know what to do with it. As always, my name is Jennifer Jones. See you next time.